The books tell us the barbarians created a time of darkness and chaos. That this age was simply a gap between the glory of Rome and the rebirth of Europe in the Middle Ages. But I believe the truth was rather different.
I suspect we've been misled by the few surviving records from the Dark Ages. I believe that we owe much more to the barbarians than we realise.
Scattered across Europe are precious clues to the world they made. In this series, I'm going in search of our elusive ancestors. I believe their reputation as history's Hell's Angels is no more than Roman propaganda. I want to find out who they really were. But first, I want to try to solve the mystery of why their legacy has remained hidden for so long. Here at Hadrian's Wall, there's a clue to why we are so ignorant of our barbarian heritage. These stones record the lives and deaths of men who served here at the end of empire, at the beginnings of what we call the Dark Ages. Here's a Roman memorial for a Roman soldier, sacred to the memory of the departed Dagvalda, soldier of the first cohort of Pannonians. Pannonia is in present-day Hungary, which means Dagvalda was not born a Roman, he was born a barbarian. And he's not the only one. When you look closer at these weathered Roman inscriptions, you can see that very few of these Roman soldiers came from Rome at all. Most were born barbarians. But when Dagvalda's widow put up this memorial to him, she stressed his Roman connections. She all but ignored his barbarian roots. It's no wonder we're ignorant of barbarian life.
It's 1600 years since the Romans left Britain. But even today, if we want to express power and stability, if we want to reflect authority and wealth, we defer to a classical age. We imitate the Romans.
And we don't just copy their buildings. Like Dagvalda's widow, we still venerate Roman culture. For centuries, Latin was at the centre of European education and religion. So it's not surprising that it's always been assumed the people who destroyed the Roman Empire were simply ignorant savages. But I'm convinced that barbarian societies must have been as complex as any other. When the barbarians overran the Roman Empire, they would have brought with them ideas, ways of relating to each other, and systems of justice. Finding evidence of what that culture was is going to be difficult. All the accounts that have come down to us about the fall of Rome were written by Romans and their allies. It's a one-sided story. To the Romans, the barbarians were ignorant, savage, and uncivilized. To the Romans, a barbarian was just a barbarian. If I'm to truly understand the barbarian point of view, then the evidence I'm looking for will have to be different. Here, in Britain, there's only one place to start. What would the barbarians have made of the kind of people who could create a structure like this, 20 feet high and 70 miles long? There's very little evidence that they wanted to invade this part of the empire. So what was the wall for?
It would have been quite an impressive thing. It showed the might of the Roman Empire. to the barbarians, but also, I suspect, also to the soldiers as well. This was a seriously big engineering feat, something they'd been involved in building for the greater glory of Rome. Hadrian was not a man who wanted to go on expanding the Roman Empire at all. He wanted to call a halt, and he wanted to have a clear barrier which says, this is Roman territory, that is not Roman territory.
It was a cultural line too. On this side of the wall, for thousands of miles, stretched a vast and secure empire. To be a Roman, even to be part of the Roman Empire, meant you belonged to an extremely powerful club. You were part of the most powerful society on earth.
At the heart of this society was the army. Without the army, the empire was nothing. Had they left anything behind? Have any weapons been found on the wall?
Remarkably few, because obviously soldiers were looking after their weapons, they were expected to. But yes, we do have the odd piece, particularly of bows, composite bows. For example, we have a little tiny piece here, and this is the top of a bow. It's called an earlath. And this goes at the very end of the bow, takes the string through here. And this is a very important part of the bow because it not only strengthens the bow, but it also helps it to be efficient, helps it to be fast and accurate.
And this presumably was a Roman invention?
No. Archery, this sort of use of a composite bow, is something which came into the Roman Empire from the East. It's the Romans adapting and adopting other people's technology.
Barbarian technology. What's special about this Eastern bow is that the end is carved out of horn, so the string can be pulled back harder and further. With this innovation, they had transformed the simple bow and arrow into a weapon that won wars. So right at the heart of the imperial war machine lies evidence of the skill and ingenuity of the barbarians. But that's not the only reason why, in unravelling the mystery of the Dark Ages, this bow could be a valuable clue. For the Romans, this was simply an efficient piece of military technology, and that's the way it looks to us today. But it was much more than that for the barbarians from the East. To them, it was a cultural icon, and for me, as an anthropologist, it's a rare physical object that gives us an insight into the barbarian worldview. It's a way into the minds of our hidden ancestors. This is how the bow would have been fired. To acquire the skills of the nomadic warriors of the Dark Ages has taken Koshoi Loyosh many years. He's tried to understand their culture from the inside, but I still can't imagine what that feels like.
If you do something your ancestors did, you can come closer, closer and closer. If I don't use the bow and don't sit on the horse, no contact. But I do every day, 2 times a day. It's a little bit closer and closer, and I can thinking about the past. I sit on the yurt, make a fire. Same. Two dozen years ago, the people say, shoot from the horse. I think it's a little bit closer. The warrior life depends on the horse. It was very close.
These nomadic warriors were individualists and wedded to their horses. Man and horse together, even in death.
First, dig a grave for the man, after dig a grave for the horse, and put the saddle and every bridle, everything on the horse, and put the horse in the grave, and shoot the horse. And there are many balls in the graveyard.
Spending time with Lajos gives me glimpses of the barbarian mind. I can see what a very different universe these individualistic guerrilla warriors inhabited from the centralized and hierarchical world of the Roman legionary. Lajos's passion and commitment is one way into their world, but I need something more tangible. My journey through the Dark Ages starts in the very last days of empire, the beginning of the 5th century. That was the time the Romans made this extraordinary map, stretching from Britannia in the west to China in the east. It's really a diagram of the world they knew. With all roads leading to Rome, it combines the simplicity of a tube map with the detail of a route planner. I'm taking it with me as a constant reminder of why we know more about the Romans than we do about the barbarians. No barbarian map survives. We don't even know if they ever made any. And this might have been the shape of our world today, except for a momentous event that happened in the dead of winter in the year 406. It happened at the most important frontier in Roman Europe, the Rhine. It was here that Rome's most important barrier collapsed. The dam holding back the barbarians burst. For the people of Europe, life would never be the same again. At the beginning of the 5th century, migrating Germanic tribes were on the move across the European plains towards the Roman world. And it was here, at the river Rhine, that they reached the edge of empire. For these migrating peoples, it was a barrier to be crossed, then forgotten. Like Hadrian's Wall, it was guarded by forts and defended by troops. But it was under far more pressure. The enemy was trying to get in.
This was a frontier town. Behind me, Pax Romana, and in front of me, Germania. This is the place where the barbarians arrived.
The Romans lumped together as barbarians, hundreds of different tribal groups under countless different chiefs in North and Eastern Europe. But where had they come from, and why, with the Vandals at the fore, did they arrive here at Mainz? The Roman books don't say. But today, using modern technology, I'm going to take a bird's eye view of Europe to try to work it out.
So in the Dark Ages, when people came from the east into Europe, which routes did they take?
Migratory peoples coming from the Eurasian steppe had various routes of access into Europe. One is crossing at the mouth of the Danube and into what was northern Greece, centrally through the Moravian Gap, and then further west, reaching the Rhine and giving access to Gaul or northern France. These are rivers which are literally hundreds of metres across, or very fast flowing where they're narrower. It's not like today where you can simply drive across a well-kept bridge. These are significant geographical barriers and strategic blocking points.
When a Vandal arrived at this barrier at the beginning of the 5th century, he'd have been confronted not only by the river, but by the might of the Roman navy. The extent of the Roman fleet only became clear in the 1980s. It was while they were excavating by the banks of the Rhine that archaeologists realised the importance of some ancient timbers they'd found buried in the mud. This discovery showed that the Romans regarded the barbarian threat seriously enough to establish an extraordinary inland navy. The timbers have been precisely dated by the science of tree ring growth to the very last days of empire. These then were the ships which secured the barbarian front line. They patrolled the river twice a day between forts which had been built about 20 miles apart. This left the Vandals and their allies facing a formidable deterrent. But I wanted to know who it was who was pushing the Vandals and their allies against the frontier.
This is the model, the Huns pouring out of the Eurasian steppe and driving the more settled people before them, so they press up against the borders of the empire, eventually desperate to fight their way in.
The horse archer armies of the Huns could cover 1,500 miles in a week. They were different from the slow-moving migrant groups like the Vandals. The Huns darted westwards, harrying the more settled tribes, shunting them up against the frontier.
The crossing of the Rhine was obviously a difficult thing. It was a very heavily defended area. And on one famous occasion, on the last day of 406, a confederation led by the Vandals actually crossed the Rhine at Mainz when the river was frozen. So they walked dry-shod into the empire. And that was a crucial moment, really, of the breakdown of Roman authority north of the Alps.
So this then, on that cold winter's night in 406, is where the barbarians seized the moment. It's the place where two worlds collided. This was one of the defining moments of European history. The Dark Ages had begun. Only 2 years later, the scholar and historian St. Jerome described the result.
I shall now say a few words of our present miseries. Savage tribes in countless numbers have overrun all parts. The once noble city of Mainz has been captured and destroyed. In its church many thousands have been massacred, and those whom the sword spares without, famine ravages within. I cannot speak without tears.
There's no question the Vandals certainly raped and pillaged Mainz. But why did they do it? 1,500 years later, is it possible for me to work out what made them tick?
Most peoples who would invade the town or city of another people and stay there would want to keep it in some good shape, but you're saying they completely decimated it.
I think these wandering tribes had no inkling of what life in the town means, and so they had no idea that the town itself had some worth.
So if they didn't want the town, what did they want?
They wanted booty, I think, and fame. For these early Germanic tribes and peoples, fame was the dominating motive.
The Vandals wanted fame, and it was their booty, Roman gold, which reflects their desire for glory.
But what did they do with the gold?
They reworked it.
Oh, they made their own objects
refashioned
out of the Roman
it
gods.
into ornaments of their own style.
So they had
Figured
good craftsmen, or?
Yes, they had. They had. And the technical quality, they are perfect. And it's utterly astonishing that people could produce such wonderful ornaments without having a fixed workshop. They all had the same way of life, living on their wagons, and so being incredibly mobile, so to speak, carrying their state with them on their wagons.
To understand the barbarians, you have to adopt their mindset. Civilization doesn't have to mean living in stone buildings. It doesn't even have to mean living in cities. Tribes like the Vandals weren't looking to settle down. They carried their state with them. They moved slowly in huge numbers with their carts and their belongings. They sacked the city, they took what was valuable to them, and they moved on. They didn't need or want the aqueducts or amphitheatres. They weren't ignorant savages. They just valued different things from the Romans. It's been hard to find evidence of these transient people. But new clues to life in the Dark Ages do occasionally emerge. In Austria, archaeologists are studying one of the most important 5th century graveyards ever found. It's yielding tangible evidence about the way of life of these Dark Age people. But they've discovered something more. Some of the skulls are grossly misshapen. And the study of them reveals something quite unexpected about the beliefs and practices of the people who lived here. In this Dark Ages graveyard, I'm hoping to find clues to help me understand the most elusive of all the barbarians, the Huns. Archaeologists have found 166 skeletons here, and forensic anthropologist Maria Teschler has made a remarkable discovery. At least 3 of the bodies have misshapen heads. Compared to ordinary skulls, these were grossly deformed.
I would say this is the most impressive one. This is the skull of a young male, around 20 years of age, and this skull shows a very severe deformation.
This was no natural malformation. These skulls had been deformed during childhood deliberately.
They used a tight bandage. We do not know about the material. Most probably it was leather or other material. And they started to do this deformation in a very early childhood, in the period shortly after the birth, because the bone is very soft in that time.
So if you tie it really tight across here, you can actually make the skull grow in a different way.
Yes.
But why would a parent do that to their own baby?
We think this is a Hun custom, and maybe the inhabitants here made a copy of this custom.
And why did they want to be like the Huns?
Because the Huns were powerful individuals, powerful people, and they tried to be like this.
This is the kind of evidence I need to help me to see the barbarians from a non-Roman point of view. To the people of that remote mountain valley, the most demonized barbarians of them all, the Huns, were not savages to be feared and despised. They were so glamorous and powerful that the community wanted to make their own children look like the Huns. Hungary, the country which that most famous of barbarians, Attila the Hun, notoriously called the Scourge of God, decided to use as his base.
The perplexing thing is that although we've all heard of Attila, the Huns themselves left remarkably few traces of their time in Europe. They're practically invisible. Almost all the archaeology they left is the dust and the charcoal of the cities they burned.
The Vandals at least left golden ornaments. The Huns, though, flashed through Europe like a comet through the sky and disappeared as suddenly as they arrived. But I'm on my way with anthropologist János Tari to meet a man who's devoted his life to searching for the Huns and who doesn't rely on Roman history. We met, appropriately, in a cafe in Attila Street. Finding out anything at all about the mysterious Huns obviously wasn't going to be easy.
It's a big problem all the time in archaeology to put together a nation with the kind of findings. Because the bones not speaking.
The bones not speaking, no.
Yes,
That's a big problem.
Even if the bones could speak, it turns out we can't be sure what the language would be.
The most possibility for the Turkish language.
So it's quite like Turkish.
Quite like Turkish, perhaps, yes.
Yeah, perhaps, yes. Perhaps. Everything with the Huns is perhaps.
Perhaps,
yeah. What kind of leader do you think Attila was?
Na. Hát most aztán megkaptam a megfelelő kérdést. Erre nem lehet egyenesen válaszolni.
It's not possible. Yes,
So the only thing we can be sure about the Huns is the name of Attila.
Egyáltalában nem lehetünk Attila nevében biztosak. Attila neve egy gót név.
We can't be sure in his name as well.
You can't be sure of his name either?
No.
So when you were young, you hoped to find all the answers to the Huns. Do you think you found all the answers?
Nem.
No.
So, the most famous barbarian leader of the most famous barbarian tribe is still out of reach. Is this as close as I can get to these people, who seem to have vanished from history? Peter Tomke was to guide me through the landscape of his nation's past.
Wow, Danube.
And using my Roman map, he placed Hungarian Pannonia in the ancient world.
So where did the Huns come from?
Huns come from
The other end.
Yes.
They come all the way.
Look.
They go down here. Pannonia.
That's Pannonia, yes.
After years of searching, he literally struck gold near his home in the provincial town of Győr in northwest Hungary, where he was to make an astonishing find.
This is good. This is good.
It was here he found a hoard of Dark Age treasure.
Ezen a vidéken
This
volt.
area was the excavation.
A discovery so rare it was to shed new light on this invisible people. It could only have belonged to a Hun.
It means they were here personally, the Huns were at this location.
The Huns were definitely here.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
What was it that Peter Tomke found that was so convincing?
We will show something which prove this is a Hun finding.
Okay. aranylemezzel borított szobrocskának a maradványa.
This is a golden covered little sculpture.
Ami egy állat alakot.
That's an animal, not realistic, yeah?
So this is the ear and the head and the...
Ear, the head and the neck and the body here.
This beautiful object's true significance only became clear when Peter told me about similar discoveries. At last I could pin down the origin of these warriors.
They found similar objects.
On a map, he explained to me that tiny golden sculptures of horses, just like this one, had been found in an arc which curved all the way from the reputed birthplace of the Huns in eastern Siberia to here in Hungary.
So these horses are like the kind of signposts of where the Huns travelled from Central Asia all the way to Hungary.
Yes, these are the proofs.
So for the first time, I found barbarian, not Roman, evidence. The Huns had moved from Asia to Europe. But there was something else. The next find symbolized the strength that lay at the heart of Hunnic culture.
And we find these.
Are these from a real Hun bow?
Yes.
It's a real Hun bow parts.
Arany.
Now this is gold.
This is the Hun golden decoration.
So all these parts were gold.
Ezek. Ezzel nem lehet egyetlen egy lövéssel leadni.
Yeah, it was a very special symbolic thing, he said, because it's impossible to shoot with this.
Különben leröpülnek
So
egy jelvény.
it wasn't actually used for shooting arrows.
It's with this golden bow, it's impossible to shoot.
So this is a bow that belonged to a leader of the Huns.
Ez az a bizonyos híres gold bow from the Huns.
So the bow that the Romans used because it was efficient, the Huns buried with their leaders. This bow was an expression of Hun identity. The golden bow wasn't even functional. It represented the power and status of its owner. The Huns didn't leave us towns or cities. They carried and buried their culture with them. The Huns had culture and skill, but to achieve their military success, they must also have had discipline and dedication. But what happened to Attila and his empire? With lightning strikes from their base in Hungary, they sacked many of the major cities of the Roman Empire. But to sustain their empire, they needed grass. In Hungary, they ran out of steppe. Then they vanished. Some must have changed their way of life and become absorbed into peasant society. Others must have returned to the east. But the biggest secret of these early Dark Ages lies with a people who didn't destroy a city and who weren't nomadic warriors. A people who conquered and then settled. They lived just like the Romans and left behind a glorious legacy. One which remained deliberately hidden for nearly 1,500 years. This is Ravenna in northern Italy. Today it's a quiet, picturesque city celebrated for its Byzantine legacy, the art and architecture created by the Eastern Roman Empire. Or was it? In fact, much of the glory of Ravenna is not Roman at all, but barbarian. Just as the Vandals had crossed over the Rhine, so another group, the Goths, had been pushed into the empire by the Huns. Here in Ravenna, the Goths took over the last capital of the Western Roman Empire. For 33 years under their king, Theodoric, it was the equal of any Roman capital. Theodoric renovated and reformed its institutions, improved and enhanced its splendour, and in a few short years created one of the wonders of the age. This would have been like walking through heaven's gates. If this had been an age of darkness, then here, without doubt, was a cathedral of light. This is Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, built by Theodoric nearly 1500 years ago, one of the brightest jewels of the Dark Ages.
I'd like you to look at the mosaics from this position. You can see that the background is shining, is reflecting the light from the windows because it was made of glass cubes and gold cubes. And the robes of the saints are dull, are opaque, because they were made using marble cubes, so as to give the impression of wool, of textiles.
These works were commissioned by Theodoric, the Gothic king. Yet most visitors today think they are Roman or Byzantine mosaics. Why should that be? Is it because we have all been conditioned to assume that work of this quality must be Roman? Perhaps there are other reasons. As I looked more closely, I began to wonder, why are there so many mosaic curtains in a scene of such splendor? And what do these hands, unattached to any bodies, signify? Could I learn the answers to these barbarian riddles in modern Ravenna? Mosaics are still being produced here in exactly the same way as they were in the Dark Ages. Only highly skilled workers could produce glass and marble with the desired effects of scattering or absorbing light. To a barbarian immigrant, the effect of turning tiny pieces like this into works of art must have seemed magical.
Can I cut one?
Can I cut?
Me?
Yes, if you want.
Okay.
Just a little. Okay.
Can you use this or not?
Yes, yes.
It's a good shape.
I
Goes here.
No, here.
No?
It's better.
Oh, there. Okay.
Okay.
These pieces, called tesserae, are cut and placed on a pattern which sometimes reveals itself only at a distance. Gold mosaic was made by placing gold leaf between layers of clear glass. It's a slow, costly and very secretive art, and it was only commissioned by the rich and powerful. Later rulers were no exception. Here's a copy of the famous portrait of Justinian, the Roman Byzantine emperor who ruled Ravenna after Theodoric. In Sant'Apollinare, I wanted to see whether the mystery of the curtains was any clearer. I realise now that they reflect so much work that they must have had a very deliberate purpose. What were they supposed to represent?
This part of the mosaic that shows you the royal palace, all this mosaic was made and commissioned by Theodoric. This mosaic has been changed, altered. We could say that it has been vandalized by the Byzantines because some images have been destroyed. Those images that had portrayed Theodoric, members of his court, members of his clergy, and that stood between the columns, now they have been replaced with curtains. But you can still see the hands here. There is one hand here, another one here, another one here, and another hand here, and another hand here. And you can still see the halos here of the heads that have disappeared. All these elements tell us that previous images have been destroyed. It was an act of censorship, we could say.
Those who succeeded Theodoric deliberately left some traces of his presence. The hands on the pillars, to emphasize their own ability to destroy his barbarian kingdom. The returning empire was determined to banish the image of Theodoric from history altogether. But one rare image of him survives.
This is a medallion that was issued in the year 500, and it's the only image that we have of Theodoric, and maybe you can see a certain similarity with the mosaic.
There certainly is a similarity between Theodoric's face on the rare medallion and the image of Justinian I'd been working on. The medallion shows Theodoric without a crown and simply dressed. And recent research has proved that the crown and the brooch on Emperor Justinian's mosaic were added later, as was the name Justinian itself. Could it be that the mosaic face had once belonged to Theodoric? What would happen if you compared the images closely?
So they really airbrushed him out?
Yes, they airbrushed him out.
The returning Romans had felt so threatened by this evidence of a barbarian culture that they removed it. But they weren't able to disguise Theodoric's tomb, a confident statement of his barbarian origins.
This is one of the most important buildings we have in Rhine. This is the mausoleum of Theodoric.
There are echoes of his early childhood on the plains of Eastern Europe. And to many, the shape of the roof resembles a yurt, the tent favoured by nomads from the east.
We know also that Theodoric came from a people, nomad people, but he lived in a palace during when we was in Ravenna, not in a tent.
Well, most people would choose to live in a palace, I think.
Yes.
Even a nomad. So how did they build the mausoleum? Because some of this stoneworking seems very good to me.
Yes, it's very good, and there are no mortar for this building.
The vast dome of a roof was carved from a single piece of stone which was shipped across the Adriatic Sea from Istria in modern-day Croatia. Sauro found it on my map straight away.
This is the area where the stone came from for the mausoleum.
Ah, Styria.
Croatia.
Okay. This is Cyprus. Yes.
Cyprus.
And this is the Holy Land, isn't it? Oh, there's River Ganges.
Ganges, yes.
Yes.
At the end of the world.
Yeah, where is the end of the world here?
Under Theodoric, the Goths established a kingdom that foreshadowed the shape of modern Italy. A first step towards the creation of modern Europe, perhaps. But what matters to me is not so much the extent of his power, but what he believed in. I'm travelling north now to one of the most dramatic examples of Theodoric's spiritual vision. The 5th century was a time of religious ferment, and Theodoric was an Arian Christian, not a Roman Catholic. Arians, like Theodoric, didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, could not accept the divinity of Christ. For the Catholic Church, this was heresy. This track in southern Austria once led to a walled city perched high in the mountains and long since vanished. It's a place where he protected both branches of Christianity and let them worship side by side. Side by side on the top of the mountain, stand the ruins of two ancient churches. The Catholic Church on one side, and here, some 50 yards away, the Aryan Church. As the two congregations worshipped, they must have heard each other's prayers. This just and civilized barbarian said once, "We cannot command the religion of our subjects, since no one can be forced to believe against their will."
Here, as in Ravenna, the Goths displayed an extraordinary tolerance. A tolerance perhaps we wouldn't expect to find among barbarians, and a tolerance perhaps that we're lacking today.
People still come here on pilgrimage, and though they are not honouring Theodoric's memory, it seems to me, of all the barbarians, he's the one we should remember. The barbarians have been dismissed as the Hell's Angels of history. For 1500 years we've had a one-sided view of them. I've discovered there is no one label that can be applied to the various tribes who took Europe from the Romans. The Vandals who breached the frontiers at Mainz simply valued different things and a different way of life. The Huns formed a military force which was able to rival and overpower the Romans, helped by a technology which was to change warfare for 1,000 years. More than that, they were a sophisticated and cultured people. The enlightened Gothic kingdom of Theodoric showed itself at least the equal of Rome, and in many ways its superior, especially in tolerance. This barbarian world so threatened the Romans that their historians and propagandists tried to erase it from history. I've reached the end of the first part of my journey, but in the far northwest of Europe, another wave was breaking. This time they would arrive by boat. But were they barbarians intent on destruction, or immigrants striving to create a new world? When the Romans left Britain, they took their money with them. It was to be the last single European currency for 1500 years. But almost immediately, a new people began to make their presence felt.
But in 1982, a gold medallion from the 5th century was found in a field in Suffolk. Carefully inscribed with foreign letters called runes, it reads, "This she-wolf is a reward to my kinswoman." The meaning may be mysterious, but the significance is clear. A new language is being spoken, the language that was to become English.
Have your passport, please, sir.
Today, English, one of the most widely spoken languages on earth, is Britain's greatest export. It's the language of international commerce and modern communication, yet its roots lie deep in the so-called Dark Ages. Who were the people that gave us this gift? Where did they come from? I'm going on a journey back into the darkest part of the Dark Ages, and I'm looking for the people who gave us this language and who gave us so much more.
This is northern Germany, near the North Sea ferry port of Bremerhaven. The people who lived here used a runic alphabet, just like the inscriptions on that Suffolk medallion. The line between the sea and the land has been blurred here for millennia. Today, a dike holds back the tide, but 1500 years ago, the people on these salt marshes lived under the constant threat of the sea.
Now, although this may not look like much today, this is the site of the old village of Feddersen-Veerde. It was built on a mound to protect it from the sea. But then, around 450 AD, it was abandoned. Who were these people? Why did they leave? And what I really want to know is, where did they go? So who were the people that lived here?
They were called Saxons.
So would life have been hard here for people in Saxon times?
Yes, certainly. Probably by the age we're in now, we would be considered to be old men already.
Were they warriors as well?
They were certainly warriors, but they did not face any attack here.
The Saxons of Fedus and Virda had no fear of their neighbours, but the threat from the rising seas was another matter. When the settlement was excavated, there emerged the story of a community which had managed to find a way of living on these precarious islands of mud for hundreds of years.
Surprising to see these combs, because I suppose a lot of people tend to think of the Saxons as being unkempt people.
Yes, it's funny you use this word unkempt. In German we say ungekämmt, which is exactly uncombed. And some Germanic tribes actually threw them into the piece of land they wanted to own, to make it their land.
You can tell a lot about people from how they choose to bury their dead. The people who lived here buried their leaders in boats.
The tradition of burying people in boats can be traced back to the 1st century in southern Scandinavia, but it actually spread around the whole North Sea.
So who was buried in here?
His furnishings show that he was a soldier in the Roman army. He had a belt buckle that showed that he must have been of a relatively high rank. And when he came back to his homelands, he was buried with his
full military honours.
Yes, so to speak.
So if this man was perhaps in the Roman army, where might he have served?
He might actually have served in England.
This man was a Saxon, but as a soldier in the Roman army, he was part of the multicultural Roman club. So when his community buried him, they chose not only to bury him in a boat, as befitted a Saxon warrior from the shores of the North Sea, they also buried him with a throne and footstool after the fashion of a Roman emperor. A footstool inscribed with Saxon runes.
It says Scamella, and it means a little stool. Then the next side it says Lgu Skathi, and it means the harming of the deer, and this is actually what is depicted on the back side of the little stool. The deer has got his tongue hanging out, so in the next few moments he will collapse.
Here lay a Saxon warrior who may have served with the Roman army in England, buried in his homeland, traditionally in a ship. With him, in his grave, a stool inscribed in the same runic alphabet as that mysterious medallion from Suffolk. A runic medallion that had itself been copied from a common Roman coin commemorating the founding of Rome, but with an added runic message. The Dark Ages were a time of shifting cultural identities and of upheaval. We know from pollen evidence that the climate at Fedus and Virda was changing. The sea level was rising and the fields were flooding. It became impossible to live here anymore. These marshland Saxon villages vanished suddenly during the 5th century. The Saxons had to move on, but where to? It's a long and dangerous journey from here across the North Sea to the British Isles. Mainland Europe offered little more than a landscape of shifting populations and tribal competition.
These huge rivers were once the highways and the boundaries of the Dark Ages. I'm going further north towards Denmark, to a place that was once the home of another people, the Angles.
The Angles came from the Jutland Peninsula in what is now southern Denmark. It was from here that they moved as the Roman Empire fell apart. They too were a people with a maritime tradition. This is the Neudem ship. It is one of the oldest known rowing vessels from northern Europe. It was found preserved in a peat bog where it had been deliberately sunk in the Dark Ages. And when the timbers were dated, scientists were astonished to discover that this skillfully made ocean-going ship was built 100 years before the Saxons left Fedus and Virda. It demonstrated beyond doubt that Dark Age tribes had sophisticated shipbuilding skills. The Neudem ship had a turbulent history.
It was found in a place close to here, now north of the border. And we think it's a part of loot, which has been put as a sacrifice into a lake after a battle which was won by the local population.
And who was the god that they sacrificed it to?
Odin is the god of the war, so he should have got it.
Odin claimed the spoils of several vanquished armies in this peat bog.
We found hundreds of these swords together with the ship.
All the weapons showed the scars of war.
You see these hacks here, these small hacks? Those shows traces of the last battle. It's not a village fighting another village.
No, it's big scale.
It's big scale.
So were these troubled times in the Dark Ages here?
I think so. 50 years or a little bit later, after this boat was sunk, the whole region gets quite empty, at least from archaeological finds. We have almost no cemeteries anymore, no settlements, which are difficult to date. Of course, in England appear people who speak a Germanic language, and there are some more than expected in England and some less than expected here, so this makes a sense.
The people were leaving. What were the main reasons, do you think, why they left?
One is the climate. It seems as if from the 3rd century onwards it gets cold and wet. Another push factor could be the wars. This is just one example for this, all these weapons. There was a wartime which also might move the people.
And you think that this could have acted as quite a good cross-channel ferry between Germany and
There
England?
could be better ones, but if you don't have anything else, this would work as well. Even this boat, I wrote a simulation program for this, it would be able, in 9 years, 50 boats would transport 30,000 people to England, no doubt.
The computer analysis showed that in a century, hundreds of thousands could be transported. So it is possible that large numbers of Angles, Saxons and others could have moved across those 5th century seas.
What kind of ship would you need to migrate? Travelling the seas in an open boat was a journey fraught with danger. Being in a rowing boat wasn't easy, but what was the alternative?
There is little archaeological evidence of actual Anglo-Saxon ships, but historic ship expert Edwin Gifford believes they may have mastered a crucial technological innovation. So he made a replica of a Saxon ship to put his theories to the test.
Level. So how proud are you of this boat?
Well, we're very pleased with it. Yes, we are really rather proud of it too, I suppose, privately, as it were. Yes, I think the main reaction really was a great admiration for the blokes that worked it up in the first instance, you know, the Saxons themselves. The manoeuvring is remarkably good. You think of a rather long, narrow boat with a straight keel, it does very well. Amazing.
Do you think the Saxons and Angles would have migrated to this country in boats like this?
It's not so far different from this. I mean, the same sort of boat, yes. Whether they had sail or not, of course, is a point of debate. Probably they did.
The sail and the ability to tack to sail into the wind would allow ships like this to cross the high seas and return home. So where did they get their boat building skills from? From the Romans?
No, I don't think so. It developed somewhere in the Baltic with boats like this, which were very stiff and strong. And the trick of it is that everything's clamped together with these rivets. There's nothing able to slide on each other. Whereas earlier than that, these have been sewn or wooden pegs have been used.
Edwin Gifford's Saxon ship is fast, seaworthy and manoeuvrable. It seems to be clear that the Angles and Saxons would have navigated across the North Sea with ease.
Stand by to jibe. Ease your main sheet. That's it. Ho!
So they could get around pretty quickly.
They could be anywhere up that east coast before anybody knew they were coming. The first thing you knew, you had 300 men on your doorstep in 3 ships, saying, where's the money? Or whatever purpose they're going for. Because nobody could travel at that speed at all. And across the North Sea, the same too.
How long would it have taken to cross the North Sea?
Well, about 2.5, 3 days. Yes, given the right weather, waiting in the right conditions. 2 nights. Stand by to jibe. Ease your main sheet.
I have always thought of the sea as protecting Britain from invasion, but in the Dark Ages it seems it was the sea that joined it to Europe. Britain was surrounded by a natural highway that gave easy access to invaders, leaving the people already abandoned by the Roman legions unprotected and vulnerable, just at the moment when barbarians from northern Germany were looking for a new home.
The North Sea crossing points of today have existed for thousands of years. In the Dark Ages, people would have arrived on these shores at points just like this.
But was it a mass invasion led by warriors driving everyone before them, or were they simply a few economic migrants arriving in small numbers, ready to settle in peace? The answers may lie close to where that mysterious runic medallion was found, at a place called Lakenheath. Today, it's the site of a very different band of warriors. It's an American military airbase. Lakenheath has been an airfield for more than half a century, but the area's connections with the military go back thousands of years. Iron Age, Celtic and Roman armies all watered their horses here. The clearest indication that Germanic invaders were here is in the name, Lakenheath, which comes from Lokenheit, a Saxon word meaning the landing place of Laker's people. This landing place became, for many, a final resting place.
Here, in the heart of what, for all intents and purposes, is a small American town, lie warriors of the Dark Ages. But not just warriors, because they buried their families here too.
These people were pagans. They buried their dead with an extraordinary range of objects, from combs and brooches to fully grown horses.
So what kind of things have you found here?
Well, on the cemetery we've found various objects. We've got, for example, this, which is an iron spear from an early Saxon grave, a male grave, probably 6th century. There are various different types of spears that can be dated to a certain extent.
So if you found about 100 of these spearheads, does that mean that there was a lot of fighting going on?
Probably not. We haven't found any evidence in any of the people, in the bones of the people, that anybody suffered any kind of real trauma. So we think this is probably to say how important the person is rather than an indication that they're going out and killing people. This is a large cruciform brooch, but if we have a look on the back here, this is the clothing of the woman who was wearing it. We're looking at a piece of cloth that is 1,500 years old, which is, I think, unbelievable, an incredible thing to see. The cruciform brooches are particularly Anglian, which is the Angles, basically, who come in and form East Anglia.
Do the Germanic brooches give us the first evidence for Saxon settlement, or did they belong to Britons who were affecting the glamorous trappings of fashionable foreigners?
The evidence that the people themselves are Germanic is very difficult to say. But what we have are various objects which can be seen to have clear links with the continent, such as pots like this, where the decorations are very similar to the pots and the decorations that are coming up in Northern Europe from the same kind of period.
So it is a real sign of change, really.
Yes, it is, yeah. We certainly know that people are coming in. What we don't know is how many people are coming in and what proportion of the population they make up.
One of the rarest and most dramatic finds in Anglo-Saxon graves is a sword. It was a highly prized weapon and expensive to produce.
We've got the skull at this end, and then we've got the sword on that side of the grave. You can see the hilt up fairly close to the skull, to the top of the skull, down to the tip here.
So the swords are much rarer than the spears?
Yes, they are, and they are almost certainly a sign of status.
I wonder if today's Anglo-Saxon warriors would be buried with their planes or not.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
mind you, the planes are a bit more expensive than the swords and the spears, aren't they?
They certainly are. I don't think it's going to happen somehow.
Women dressed in Germanic fashion, warriors with swords but with no signs of battle. The evidence from Lakenheath is ambiguous. But if I can't be sure exactly who they were, I can at least discover the talents and skills they brought to these shores. To understand a people who didn't write things down, we have to search for clues wherever we can find them. At first sight, a Saxon sword blade seems a simple object, a piece of sharpened iron. But the right person can read a sword as easily as a book.
Well, the Saxon sword smiths were specialists in the work that they do, and the swords that they made had this wonderful patterning in them, which to start with was quite accidental because they were trying to get the metal to fold over, and the more you forge the metal, the more refined it becomes, so you get a better blade.
The challenge for the Saxon smiths was to make a sword that combined flexibility so it wouldn't break and hardness to keep a sharp edge. They achieved this with the extraordinary pattern-welded sword.
In a Saxon sword blade, there are 4 different types of iron, and each type of iron is specific to doing a job in that blade. Cutting edges that go all the way around the blade and are welded in are made out of non-phosphoric iron and a medium carbon steel, so that you get a hard cutting edge. There's the first weld, just to get the ends fixed together. Now I'm going to put it back in again, take another welding heat and start welding back. If a Saxon smith came into this workshop now, he would know exactly what I was doing.
And he'd feel right at home.
He would say, but you don't want to do it that way.
I can see you better.
They were making this sort of structured blade 600 years before the Japanese started. We go on about the Japanese samurai blades. They were doing it 600 years earlier.
So the Saxons beat the samurai to this.
Yeah. You can see that this is an X-ray of an actual Saxon sword, and you can see the patterning in it. To get your patterns, you twist your metal. And when you've done all these, you then weld those 4 together into one piece.
So from start to finish, how long does it take to make a Saxon sword?
I would say on the average somewhere around about 80 hours work to forge the sword.
At the end of a man's life, what would happen to his sword?
This is the fascinating thing about it, is that they buried them with them. A precious weapon like that, and it went with him. And this is how we find them today, but we don't find that many.
So the swords reveal a people skillfully working with a technology far more advanced than we might have expected in the Dark Ages.
And these blades, when they were finished and sharpened up, they literally would cut a man in half. They would take arms off, they would take legs off, and there is a recorded incident of someone cleaving his opponent from his collarbone right through to his hip.
So they worked.
They worked, yeah. You see now, Richard, this is the blade that has been ground and polished, and what we're going to do is bring out the pattern by using an acid. Starting to come through up here.
It's like watching a photograph developing. What do you think of the fact that such a thing of beauty can have such a destructive effect?
That is the sad part about it all, really. I tend not to dwell on that. I look at it as a work of art made by a craftsman that knows his job.
The Anglo-Saxon craftsmen were highly skilled in metalwork, but because their ships and houses were built in wood, they have left us with little more than shadows on the ground. I want to know more about the ideas they brought and discover whether, as my old school books claimed, they lived in hunger, poverty and dirt. Did the Angles and Saxons who came to these islands 1500 years ago come in force displacing a local population, or did they arrive in small numbers eager to assimilate? A chance discovery in this North Yorkshire sand quarry offers some surprising answers.
Right, well, we came here first in 1978 because someone found an Anglo-Saxon grave during quarrying. And so we came in, started the excavation, but it was a time when there was virtually no evidence of settlement. One of the big problems of Anglo-Saxon England, it was populated by dead people. There were no living.
Just cemeteries.
Just cemeteries.
But at West Heslington, for the first time, they have documented an entire Anglo-Saxon world, although there's nothing to see on the surface.
For the first time, we've managed to excavate a complete cemetery and a complete settlement. For the most part, we have the most complete picture of an early to Middle Saxon settlement that we have from anywhere in this country. Now, we're coming into the cemetery from the eastern side, and this sort of platform here was occupied by a major Neolithic monument, a henge with a ditch and bank around it, and entrances on either side. So yes, there's a real corker. This is a real traditional Anglo-Saxon burial, this one.
Just as at Lakenheath, this site shows a continuity of occupation since the Iron Age. The cemetery contains 220 burials, uncovering 4 centuries of Anglo-Saxon settlement. 2 burials in particular challenge conventional expectations about Anglo-Saxon men and women.
We have a female burial with 2 spears, and then we have a very definite male burial with brooches and beads. What we can be sure of is that the traditional view of, this one's got lots of brooches, it must be a girlie, and this one's got weapons, it's a chap, is no longer acceptable.
So, how do you know they were Saxons?
The population in this part of the country we would consider to be Anglians rather than Saxons. How many of them are actually continental? It's certainly not more than 20%.
There was a population of perhaps 1.5 million people on these islands when the Romans left. Just how many migrants would it take to make a major impact?
I'm quite happy that we are dealing with relatively small numbers of people, but maybe arriving over quite a long time, maybe over 200 years. But the real problem is then, why does everybody then look like an Anglo-Saxon when we dig them up? I believe that we can explain away the rapid adoption of Anglo-Saxonness on the grounds that it was a deliberate attempt to break those Roman traditions.
So how many people do you think would have lived there at any one time?
Probably about 100. We've got about 200 buildings, but of course they're spread over 400 years of activity.
Yes.
But the plan of the settlement shows tremendous organisation. So the centre of town, I think, was this bit down here.
This was downtown. Yeah.
All the houses here seem to have been planned to the same few designs.
It's almost as if there's an Anglo-Saxon Mr. Wimpy or Mr. Barrett out there who has a book of building plans, and you choose whichever one you like. It's interesting enough that that occurs on this site, but it's quite remarkable that that occurs throughout early Anglo-Saxon England. They had plenty of meat to eat, all round a good and varied diet. They're eating wild fowls and they're hunting and gathering as well as growing crops out in the fields. And they're managing that landscape as well.
So it doesn't sound really like the Dark Ages.
No, I think the Dark Ages is the worst accident of naming that's happened to the past. It's a ridiculous concept. They were doing terribly fine. I mean, just one object. We've had 800,000 animal bones. This is just a cattle toe bone.
Is that a cat?
Yep.
So this is a kind of equivalent to a China cat that people buy today. They put it on the mantelpiece.
Or somebody's just carved it for fun. When we started working here, the view of early Anglo-Saxon England was of a primitive pagan society living in scruffy little farmsteads, eking out a living in the land. We now have huge villages populated by relatively well-off people that are clearly in communication and trade with people not only in this country but abroad. And without that sophistication at this point, Anglo-Saxon England could never have developed.
The trading routes of the Dark Ages were the seaborne routes of ideas and skills, and the traffic was not just one way. Whatever we call them, and they certainly didn't call themselves Anglo-Saxons, these newcomers from the east were to dominate life on these islands for 400 years.
West Stow in Suffolk is the site of an early Anglo-Saxon village. I've come here because I want to try and get a sense of what it felt like to be an Anglo-Saxon. And it seems to me that the reconstructed village of West Stow is a pretty good place to start.
West Stow was an early Anglo-Saxon village in a landscape that had been managed for hundreds of years. It would have been self-sufficient at a time when markets and towns were unknown to the newcomers. Today's Anglo-Saxons are part-time enthusiasts.
We think that at any one time there are around about 30-ish people living here, probably an extended family, probably of 3 generations. It seems reasonable to think there were similar settlements in the area.
Nice thing about this, it's rather like the Black & Decker workmate of its time. Yeah. Except, of course, here you can move the wood around any direction you like and grip it immediately.
They were anything but crude. Their knowledge of the material they were working with was immense. Their skills were immense. You've only got to look at some of the metalwork and some of the woodwork and the jewellery and stuff from the period. If I've got to live at any time during the Dark Ages in any place, I think I'd quite happily settle for here.
The village appears isolated today, but in Saxon times it would have had close links with the outside world as part of the largest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, East Anglia.
This is a cowrie shell, which you're probably familiar with. And this, of course, has come from the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean. And I think it's important to realise that a village like this was not totally out of touch with the rest of the world. Somebody, somehow, got things like this and things like ivory, and possibly also the garnets, which may be in this brooch. It's a Frankish brooch, not an Anglo-Saxon brooch at all. This is a bit strange, isn't it? It's an iron thing, and it's obviously possibly a key. I think this one could have functioned as a key, but there are a lot of much bigger ones made of bronze with quite elaborate ornaments on them, and they're usually called girdle hangers. And the fact that a woman is buried with a bunch of these things shows that she was a woman who had some authority. Women had rather more independence than they had had in the previous Roman period, or indeed perhaps than they were to have in the later post-conquest Norman period.
Life in Anglo-Saxon Britain was not always peaceful. With many kingdoms in competition, there would have been occasions when the men of the village would have been called to arms.
Yep. Anyway, the shot they'd be aiming for, judging from the skeletal evidence, is to bring a blow in onto the skull, towards the front of it with the tip of the sword, so it cuts down through the skull to just above the eye, and hopefully that's enough to destroy your enemy's brain and kill him without you actually getting your sword jammed in his head.
I wouldn't want to inconvenience you by doing that.
The Anglo-Saxons themselves, I think there's a lot of stuff that they've left us in our culture nowadays. Things like sense of humour and our attitude towards things, and the sense of humour that you see in things like the riddles and the poems is the same sort of stuff you find in things like carry-on movies and things like this. It's all the innuendos and the double entendres and things like that.
There's one about an onion and how unpeeling it makes a woman weep, that kind of thing. And there are a lot of others which I'm not prepared to go into on screen in a family programme.
Such as?
Well, you know, if I was going to be completely Anglo-Saxon, I could say I'm just going to go and take a piss or a shit or whatever, and of course it wouldn't be as crude, it's just the word itself.
The word they used.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxons didn't bring books. Their stories, myths, laws and legends were carried with them in their heads. Their greatest legacy to England is the language.
Is that why the Saxons had so many combs?
Yeah.
Get the nits out.
Clean hair. You and I are speaking to each other in English. And that English, although I think it would have been difficult for an original inhabitant of West Stow to understand us, is nonetheless the same language. We don't speak Latin, we don't speak French, we speak English. And that's the language that arrived here in the 5th century with the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes and all the rest.
The echoes of our past still resonate today. Most of the words in English have Anglo-Saxon origins. Even the name England is derived from Angle.
Chwet, vi gardena in Jerdagum. Theotkunningas, rumjufrunon, huda evelingas, ellen fremmedon.
In the 7th century, the villagers of West Stow were caught up in a crisis that was to change the culture of England forever. The seas that brought their ancestors now ferried Christian missionaries from Ireland and Rome. The Anglo-Saxon world was about to be caught up in a battle between a pagan past and a Christian future. The Anglo-Saxon tribes who came to these shores left little to mark their presence, but perhaps their greatest secret lay buried beneath the earth for 1,300 years.
I've been trying to peel away the myths and legends that surround the Dark Ages, and now I've come to the British Museum, this great temple of classical architecture, because within its walls lies the spirit of a society that can still dazzle us today.
By the 7th century, there were 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms vying for supremacy, all with kings armed with family trees to prove their legitimacy, claiming ancestry from both Roman Caesar and Odin, the pagan god of war. Anglo-Saxon society was transformed by the arrival of Christian missionaries. The notion of one god and one king would provide a powerful force for change. This is the Sutton Hoo treasure, the crown jewels of the Anglo-Saxon world and the grave goods of a pagan king, and they reveal the struggles of that crucial moment in English history.
This isn't the kind of thing a person would normally expect to associate with the Dark Ages. The workmanship's fantastic.
No, it's absolutely amazing. No, I mean, this is your real top-of-the-market object. I mean, the workmanship on it, the way the garnets are cut, you can see here, and the way they've set blue stone, mille-fiori, blue glass, in as precious jewels. I mean, it's quite a remarkable piece. We say it's a shoulder clasp, a pair of shoulder clasps, and they would have been worn literally on the shoulder like this. It opens on a hinge. If I just break it like this, you can see the hinge coming up. There's no doubt that the shoulder clasps are made en suite, if you like, with the purse lid, certainly. And then if you accept that the purse is worn on the belt that carries the great gold buckle, you've got these three extraordinary pieces of, what you could call sort of civil ceremonial gear, which are in direct contrast to the helmet, the shield, and the sword. All this is an expression of disposable wealth and a sort of confidence in the continuation, if you like, of a dynasty. It's the king is dead, long live the king. We can afford to put all this stuff in the grave.
The Sutton Hoo treasure is an expression of early Anglo-Saxon kingship. The body of the king was never found, but the burial has been dated to 625, suggesting that here lay King Redwald, the last of the pagan kings and the first overlord of England. Just 8 generations after their ancestors came to these shores, the Anglo-Saxons would have to make a choice between their old pagan gods and a new Christian empire.
The River Deben is a quiet backwater, a place that time seems to have forgotten. But in Anglo-Saxon times, it was a busy thoroughfare and the heart of a powerful kingdom. The estuaries of Suffolk were just a short hop across the North Sea to the mouth of the Rhine, Europe's busiest artery. This was the front door, not just to East Anglia, but to the whole of Britain.
It was from this river 1400 years ago that a royal sailing barge was hauled up onto the shore. It was then dragged up a 300-metre slope to the ridge above, where it was to become a coffin fit for a king. At the edge of this plateau, overlooking the estuary of the River Deben, lies a group of low circular mounds. These are the Sutton Hoo burial grounds.
There may be no crumbling ruins or mysterious stone monuments here, but the simplicity of this site belies its importance, because it represents a turning point in English history.
Superstition and myth had haunted this place for centuries. Mrs. Pretty, who owned the land, claimed to have seen shadowy figures on the mounds at night. She decided to go digging. The first of a long series of excavations began with the opening of 3 mounds. All had been robbed. On the eve of World War II, the largest mound was excavated. They found not a ship, but the shadow of a ship in the sand. No wood had survived, though its shape had been preserved in its sandy tomb for nearly 1400 years. At its heart, the king's treasure still remained virtually intact.
This is Mound 2, Richard, which we've reconstructed. So we're now walking down into its quarry ditch here, which we excavated to start with.
That's a great view, yeah.
There are 18 mounds that we know about. You see, they're quite spread out and originally much higher. So quite a grand monument with a strong profile that you could see from the river. The people who were living here definitely had ancestral connections. I mean, whether or not you believe in large-scale or small-scale migrations, I don't think there's any doubt that the Angles of East Anglia were related or had relatives and may even still have had land in places like Jutland and Denmark. They were in contact, yeah. I see boats going up and down this river, visiting those other places. This is the reconstructed Mound 1, the famous one, and that's where the ship was. The ship stretched from here, this white post, to the other white post, which you see there. So that's 90 feet, 27 meters, and these 2 posts, modest indication, but they show you how big this boat was. We've got to think of ourselves as down at ground level and walking along the side of the boat, and then in the middle is this big, it's like a big wooden garden shed, probably with a slopey roof. And then you're looking down into a chamber and there's a floor, and then on the floor there's a man lying. The man is lying here with his feet that way to the east and his head here. And at this end of the chamber you have the sort of regalia, the sceptre, the standard. His shield is up against the wall of the chamber. And then the sword, and then the helmet about here, which then broke into lots of pieces. A pile of silver bowls, and then bundles of spears, so all the weaponry is up that end. You know, it's like a poem, an important statement made in this great theatre of death you've got here. Each of these objects is also laden with symbolism. So you have things like the great gold buckle with its writhing snakes, which say, back off, you know, I am protecting this person. And you've got the shoulder clasps with their beautiful inlaid garnets, which say, this is a person for whom, of whom the Roman army would have been proud. And then you have piles of silver bowls which are made in Constantinople, and these say, and you know, they're of the same rank. They're in equal terms with the Byzantine emperor. So the whole thing is full of allusions: boats, travel, gold, riches, power, leadership, contact, Scandinavia, our friends across the North Sea, France, our friends, or perhaps our enemies, across the Channel.
30 years after the first Christian missionaries arrived from Rome, most of England was converted, but not all the kingdoms embraced its potent message.
This is the pivotal moment, I think, that's expressed here. It is very short-lived. And that is the cusp between the pagan world and the Christian world. On the one hand lies autonomy and freedom. On the other hand, in Europe there lies huge opportunities for trade, and for that you have to surrender something of your sovereignty. I think at that point there were battles. And maybe it's battle that does decide. If the God mighty in battle is on your side, then that's a sign of what the future ought to be.
The future lay with the Christian kings. Soon there was to be one God and one king ruling England.
So this is, for me, one last demonstrative occasion, an attempt to build a pagan kingdom in East Anglia. And that's why these mounds have been captured here. That's why it's such a sort of precious monument for us.
The moment passed, East Anglia became Christian, and Sutton Hoo was left as a place of myth and legend, but one which held darker secrets alongside its treasures. Victims garroted, beheaded and occasionally dismembered lie in clusters around the unconsecrated burial mounds. Their bodies decayed, but their dying agonies are frozen as shadows in the sand. Sutton Hoo had become an execution ground.
So these burials round Mine 5 were not human sacrifices, but they were people who were hanged by the Christian kings, perhaps for being deviant or disobeying the new rules. And this became a savage place. What had once been the burial ground of kings became a place of execution for the new regime.
The combination of kingship and Christianity would transform the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and forge the English nation. The Anglo-Saxon signature is indelibly written in the patterns of the English landscape, in our maps and our manuscripts, our dictionaries and our culture. But who were they? It seems there is no easy answer. Immigrants and the local British together created a culture and place we call Anglo-Saxon England. They didn't live in a dark age. It was an age of opportunity and change. Its engine was trade and the merging of ideas and people. They acknowledged their debt to the past and saw, in the future, possibilities. But soon their world would be overwhelmed by new ideas and new waves of barbarians from the east. In the year 625, a barbarian king was buried at Sutton Hoo. He was placed in a boat, surrounded by symbols of his power and wealth, a pagan proud of his European barbarian heritage. But he was the last of his kind. Christian missionaries were spreading throughout Europe. Things were about to change. In Britain, a new culture emerged, a Christian culture that was a unique mixture of the Celtic, the Anglo-Saxon, and the Mediterranean.
To understand this period where there's so little written evidence, I've come to the British Library to see a unique Anglo-Saxon book, one that shines a dazzling light on the Dark Ages.
Here, the world's literary treasures lie side by side. Each work tells us something about the people who made it, who they were and how they wanted to be seen. But for me, there is one work that stands out far above the rest. The Lindisfarne Gospels. This book not only demonstrates the extraordinary skills of Dark Age Britain, it's also the perfect example of what that melting pot of a society was able to achieve.
This is one of the earliest and most fantastic books to have been produced in Great Britain and Ireland, and even in the world. It contains the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John in Latin, which was the language that was commonly spoken throughout Europe at that time. To me, the most amazing thing about it in many ways is that it's almost entirely the work of one person, one artist scribe, and it would have taken at least 10 years to produce something of this sort.
I mean, just on a technical level, I mean, this doesn't look like paper.
No, it's vellum, which is prepared animal skin. So first catch a cow, then you have...
Just the one?
No, you've got about 150 here. If you look at the pigments, you've got a whole range of materials. The yellow is arsenic, so you had to be very, very careful when you were dealing with these materials. And the orange is a toasted lead, which often turns into a black or silver.
It's incredible, and I just can't believe how strong the purple is after all this time.
Yeah, the purple's cool. That seems to be a vegetable extract, and you can get it to go from red to blue and all stages of purple in between. If you add stale urine, that gives you a nice rich red, for example. So it's an amazing act of chemistry as well to be able to work out how to handle all of these things.
So what can we tell from these 2 pages about the book and its meaning at the time?
OK, you look at this page and you think, what has happened? A group of peoples coming together with very different cultures, pagan, Germanic, Romano-British, Celtic. The script that you see here is basically a version of Roman square capitals, the sort of things that you would have seen on Hadrian's Wall, etc. at that period. But what have they done? They've actually grafted on these very angular, strange square shapes, bar gate M's, etc., that you get in the runic alphabet, which has an almost magical context for them. And you can see that they're saying, we're the heirs of Rome. We've arrived. We've absorbed everything they had to teach us, and now we're carrying that forward in our own way. With the carpet page, this is a Coptic prayer mat. It's actually presenting your act of prayer and dedicating it to Christ, who is actually present there in the cross that is almost mystically embedded in the ornament. This speaks of Celtic textiles. The frame of it speaks of Germanic metalwork. If you look at the O, for example, you can see this whirling, swirling mass of Celtic spiral work that goes right back to the Iron Age. This isn't ignoring the Celtic tradition of Ireland. This is actually paying homage to that, to the Coptic world, to Rome, and to the Germanic peoples at the same time.
There was nothing else in Europe that came close to the achievement of this book. Like those treasures at Sutton Hoo, it represents the very best of pagan art and craftsmanship. But unlike those East Anglian riches, this work venerates a Christian god rather than a pagan king.
Can you imagine what it must have been like for somebody who spent their lifetime out on the wild moorlands of Cumbria, seeing something like this from the back of a dimly lit church as a mystical object that would act as that power line to God for them?
Only a few generations before, the Anglo-Saxons were neither Christian nor literate. Yet here they were producing a Christian book that's of world significance. Something very special was going on. In Roman times, Northumbria was an outpost at the edge of an empire. 300 years later, it was a powerful kingdom in the heart of the British Isles. It was here off the northeast coast of England, on Holy Island, that the sun would rise on a place of pilgrimage, which was to become the centre of a cultural revolution.
Now, it may be remote today, but this was the crucible in which the English nation was fired. In this windswept and isolated place, cut off from the mainland twice a day by the tide, a monk called Eadfrith devoted every working day for 10 years producing the Lindisfarne Gospels.
Well, here we are in Lindisfarne, the mother church of Northumbrian Christianity. This is where it all began, on a site right by a harbour, and how many of these early monasteries were by harbours going right the way down the coast. This was their link through to the rest of the world.
These northern monasteries may seem desolate and secluded to us, but in Dark Age Europe, the sea was a busy highway, and they were perfectly placed for foreign trade and for new ideas.
Although we think of monasteries as being, essentially places where the liturgy is said, I think we just ought to remember that there's all sorts of other things happening. They are technological centres.
So it was a real hive of industry.
It's a massive hive of industry. These were the nearest thing they had really to cities. In the centre, I suppose, industrial estates, all wrapped around the centre of religious activity. It is the centre of literacy. Christianity, is the religion of a book and of many books. And now, for the first time, there is the possibility of recording history and passing on history.
The Anglo-Saxon world was cosmopolitan, adventurous, and fragmented. Christianity unified people around a common purpose, and these Gospels were the glorious product of that triumph. In 8th century Europe, this was the place to be.
It was here in the northeast of England that a kind of fused culture emerged, both artistically, spiritually, which was unique and which was also far ahead of the kinds of things that were being produced in France and Italy at the same stage. It's quite remarkable.
So it really was an intellectual centre for the whole of Europe in a way.
Intellectual and cultural, and people were aware of its existence right down to the Mediterranean lands.
Literacy, of course, completely changes society. But surprisingly, Christianity also brought something else, something essential to build a modern world: science. The old Saxon church at Escombe near Durham was built in the 7th century using stone from a nearby Roman fort. The inscriptions of the 6th Legion are still just visible today. But it also contains a curious feature. Set high up on the wall above the porch is the head of an unidentified beast. It's a sundial, the earliest English sundial in its original position. It enabled the priests to divide the day for hours of prayer. And it was science in the cause of religion which was to drive the most visionary thinker of the age. He was born here by the south bank of the River Tyne in Jarrow, today the heart of the industrial northeast. He lived and worked in a monastery from the age of 7. We know him as the Venerable Bede. Bede was an Anglo-Saxon monk and the foremost thinker of his day. He was a teacher, a philosopher, a writer, and a scientist. He lived in an industrial powerhouse of prayer and devotion. Literacy and a natural curiosity were the keys to what he would go on to achieve. Bede spent his entire life in the north of England. He didn't need to travel. Here, the knowledge of the world was imported on manuscripts.
Jarrow in the Dark Ages was a European cultural centre, at least in Bede's day. He travelled very little from the site here, but he had access to hundreds of books, and he built up in his mind a picture of every aspect of the world: history, poetry, science, astronomy.
So a lot of it was really based on an early form of interlibrary loan then?
And a good number of friends in other monasteries, pen pals if you like.
Bede wrote about the idea of an English-speaking people hundreds of years before England even existed. He was consumed by the study of astronomy and the reckoning of time, and he had a way with words.
Bede was able to explain things in a way that put concepts across very clearly to people. For instance, the shape of the earth. He says the earth is round, not round like a disc or a shield, but round like a ball, being equally round in all directions. So that's a very clear explanation. Another explanation of Bede's, which I particularly like, is about the temperature zones on the earth. The middle zone being very hot, the top and the bottom zones being very cold, and the other zones being temperate and habitable. He talks about being near a very hot fire on a very icy cold winter's evening. If you're too near the fire, it's so hot that you're not comfortable. Likewise, if you're too far out in the cold of the wintry night, you don't feel the benefit of the fire and you couldn't survive that either. But in between, you're in the temperate zone where things are just about right, and that's like where we are in the world.
Bede was a pragmatist, and his passion for scientific observation was to solve the greatest dispute of the age, the accurate dating of Easter. This involved reconciling complex calculations of the movements of the Earth, the Sun and the Moon.
Bede came up with a 532-year cycle which predicted the next date of Easter, and this work was phenomenally popular and copied right across Europe.
So you're saying his scientific curiosity was really driven by a religious motivation?
Very much so, yes.
Bede's pursuit of knowledge was always for a practical purpose. In resolving the date of Easter, he had noticed the effect of the moon on the tides. This was 1,000 years before Isaac Newton used the term gravity to explain the phenomenon. Bede was the product of a religious world driven by a thirst for knowledge, a world that exported manuscripts and imported new technology and skills. It was here that they produced the earliest coloured window glass in the whole country.
This is an Anglo-Saxon window containing Anglo-Saxon glass. The light shining through gives you a wonderful sense of colour, and it would have been probably quite unlike things that people had seen before, so I think the impact would have been very stunning. It would have been quite magical.
But just as the sea lanes brought wealth, knowledge and influence, so they also brought terror and fear. The pagan world returned with a vengeance. In 793, Lindisfarne was attacked by raiders from the north. This Lindisfarne gravestone shows the end of the world. A huge cross in the sky. On the reverse is a Viking raid. The Vikings appeared to come out of nowhere, but they had sailed across the North Sea just as the Angles and Saxons had done 300 years before. This new wave of barbarians, lured perhaps by the wealth of their distant Christian cousins, It was to be the start of a new dark age, as a flourishing culture went back into the freezer.
The monastic libraries of Western Europe were destroyed. Their books were either burned or looted for their decorated covers. The monks, the craftsmen, the artists, the writers themselves were scattered. I want to know who these Northmen were, but I don't believe they were as barbaric as we've been led to believe.
Were the Vikings merely savages who plundered, raped and slaughtered? Or were they in fact the source of many of the skills and ideas that were crucial in creating modern Europe? I've come to Scandinavia, home of the Vikings. I want to understand the people whom the Christian chroniclers tell us were barbarians. Were they simply raiders, or were they also traders?
Now, this is a model of a monk from Lindisfarne recording the raids of the Vikings, but everything else in this cabinet is either Irish or Anglo-Saxon, but we don't know whether it was traded or whether it was raided. For example, down here we have some crosses which probably belonged to the front of Bibles, and it looks to me like they've been wrenched off, so I would say this is raiding, not trading.
The extraordinary reach and influence of the Vikings was based on one thing: their domination of the seas. The Vikings had a boat for every purpose: fishing boats, trading boats, and largest of all, the Viking longship. These may only be fragments of boats, but it is still possible to detect the skills of these people and to reveal the secret at the heart of the longship.
All the Viking ships, they were very light boats, very flexible boat. This one would be very flexible, and therefore you have to know a lot about using the right materials. A boat building tradition, I mean, it's not only your own experience, it's your fathers and your grandfathers and so on. They were born with an axe in their hands.
These 21st century boat builders are rediscovering their ancestral skills.
If you're going to build a replica Viking ship, where do you actually start?
In the forest.
In the forest, yeah. Get some wood.
Yeah.
The Vikings had no saws. They split trees into planks using just an axe. They achieved strength, flexibility and lightness in their ships by shaving this timber down to a thickness of 2 centimeters, a finger's width.
So am I ruining your plank?
No, you're doing quite fine actually.
So is this the kind of axe the Vikings would have used?
This is a copy of a Viking axe. And also you can see it on the old planks from the original ship. You can see the traces from the old axes.
So you can tell what kind of axe from the different kinds of marks?
That's right,
yeah. I'm beginning to understand these northern skills. Planks fastened with iron nails. Then threads of tarred wool sealed the wood. This way, the flexible, watertight hull would gradually take shape. In Viking times, it was all planned without paper and pencil.
But how did they do this? I mean, they didn't have sort of technical drawings like...
No, they had experience and some simple rules. The master builder who is building the boat, he has already built the boat in his head, actually.
The Vikings handed down knowledge and experience from generation to generation. But without literacy, without the ability to write things down, 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom can disappear virtually overnight, leaving no trace of an immense storehouse of knowledge.
The Viking Age, they made very beautiful and good ships. It's incredible to look at the original boat and look at the materials, how good they were.
This Viking longship held another secret. Timber research showed it was not built here in Denmark at all. It is made of Irish oak, cut from trees near the Viking city of Dublin. So the evidence of this longship shows the Vikings were not just raiders, they were also settlers. And they took their considerable skills with them to the lands they settled.
Sånn kan de ha sett ut når de, før det var rustent og råttent. Mjød og øldeig, ja. Drikkehorn. Det stemmer. Det er fra kua.
But actually, the Vikings didn't exist as a people. The word Viking simply means to go raiding. Most Scandinavian people were peaceful farmers who stayed at home and raised their families and crops. We know little about early Viking society because there are few written records. Their story must be pieced together from the evidence of runestones and graves. As pagans, Vikings carried their status with them to the grave. Important people were buried in splendid burial mounds. It was here in Norway that a grave mound was opened, revealing a magnificent ship with a surprising secret. The Viking warship is one of the most potent symbols from history, and its source is this amazing vessel, the best preserved ship of its age. But history has done it something of a disservice because it never carried bloodthirsty warriors on their way to rape and pillage. It was an elegant pleasure yacht, the most sophisticated of its kind, and it was owned by a woman. The Oseberg ship was found complete with mast, rudder and full complement of 30 oars. It was a royal tomb with 2 burials inside, both of them women.
The ship was a burial for a queen, so at least we can say that you had a female on the top in that society, or she was the chieftain or the leader here. But if she was the leader on board, we can't be sure when they were sailing out at sea. So it tells us something about women in Viking Age, but not everything.
But surely it tells us that women, or at least some women, had a very powerful role.
No doubt. It shows us that she must have had a lot of power, not only in the ship, but also all the belongings she got with her in the grave.
A queen and her servant, perhaps, buried with a cargo of unparalleled luxury. It included a finely decorated 4-wheeled cart and 3 sleighs, carved animal heads, 3 beds, a loom and a chair. So you think that all these things were put in there because she was going to sail to the other world, to heaven?
Yeah, she could also have got all these belongings with her just to show who she was, that actually she could afford to bring all her things with her to the grave, to show her rank in the society.
It seems to me there was nothing barbarian or uncivilized about craftsmen who carved so beautifully.
They are maybe the most magnificent piece of Viking Age art we have here at the museum. These wood carvings are so beautiful and they are nearly impossible to copy. You can see all the different animals, figures, all the way, typical Viking Age. And the amazing thing is that we don't know what it was used for. It could have been tied up on a wall, it could be a corner of a bed, post or a chair, but they have never been on the top of the prow of the ship.
For me, the carvings on the ship itself also make it a work of art.
These wood carvings, they are extremely nicely done, and nearly always it's animals like this. It's snakes, dragons, they are always fighting each other. It shows that it was more to the Vikings than rape and plunder. They made these beautiful ships.
So the Oseberg ship demonstrates that the Vikings were a wealthy and highly skilled society. I mean, the preservation is fantastic. It's almost like it was made yesterday.
Actually, if you go like this, you can go near it, and if you want, you can smell the Viking Age. Actually, you can't touch the ship, but you can come really close to history.
The sheer presence of the boats has brought me closer to the Vikings. I can see them now as people who were creative and skillful, adventurous as well as sometimes brutal. The boats have also shown me how these qualities were added to European society. The Vikings were colonizers as well as raiders. But I now know there was a third element to Viking success, and it's that legacy that I have a hunch will prove to be the most crucial. The Vikings were not just bloodthirsty warriors and hard-working settlers. They were businessmen who traded over huge distances to make their money. This was the Hong Kong of its day.
I've come to the Swedish island of Gotland to find out about a people that accumulated a huge amount of wealth based on a trading network that ran from the Baltic to the Black Sea.
The sea has always been central to the identity of the people of Northern Europe. In prehistoric times, these islanders even buried their dead in stone ships. But I want to find out more about the mysterious Viking memorials. These are not the Vikings filtered through Christian chroniclers. For the first time, I'm seeing how they saw themselves.
It's a kind of a memory stone for someone who's died abroad.
The body may be in another country somewhere.
Russia or Arabic area, whatever, yes. So we think the stones are a kind of a memory stone for someone who died somewhere else. And they used to put them up along a road where people could see them very clearly.
These are memorials to the lost travelling salesmen and long-distance raiders of the Dark Ages. They died on business trips as far away as the Black Sea. The stones were once inscribed with pictures of ships, but time and weather have taken their toll.
If you look very carefully, at least from this angle, you can see the sail here. Here you can see part of it.
And over here as well?
Yeah, exactly. Here they're coming. And this is very typical with this crisscross of lines, making a kind of picture of the sail.
So here you'd have a picture of the ship, and then you'd have the man whose memorial it was being received in heaven. And at the top you'd have Odin, the king of the gods.
Very common on every stone is, of course, a ship. And I think that points to the importance of the ship for this island. And of course, the ship means to travel for the dead to the other side. And also in life, you were merchants traveling on the sea down to the Arabic world and so on.
So these are quite small ships, aren't they?
Exactly. We have no picture of big ships whatsoever on the picture stones. Every ship on the picture stones are somewhere between 15 and 20 people, small ships. In a way that's rather logical. If you go up to the Russian River, you can actually transport it over land from one river to another.
So this isn't for war, this is for trade.
That the Gotlandic was very much engaged in trade.
Bye. 20 years ago, this replica Viking ship was sailed and manhandled down the Russian rivers to the Black Sea. It retraced the arduous journeys made by their Viking ancestors 1,000 years before. To get from river to river, the crew had to haul it overland for hundreds of kilometers before finally reaching Istanbul. This was how the Vikings opened up a vast trading empire from the Baltic to Byzantium.
Okay, let me show you the place where we've been excavating. And I must tell you, you need a lot of imagination. You have to think about a place with about 400 or 500 people living here. Hundreds of houses, ships coming in, and a well-protected harbor. It's this tiny, tiny piece of needle. You can imagine what it's made of?
It looks like ivory.
Yeah, it is. And it's very, very smooth and extremely well preserved.
So is it walrus?
Probably, yes. We can't say, of course, it comes from Greenland, but you know they have a lot of that material up there. So that might show a Western contact. Can you guess what this is? Have you seen it? It's an egg. We used to call them resurrection egg. It has a Greek Orthodox Christian symbol from Kiev.
From Kiev in the Ukraine?
Yeah. This is cornelian bead. You can see it's lovely in the sun. This is probably coming from Arabic area or from the Black Sea area. Let's go further south to Italy. This little tiny piece is actually glass. It's called millefiore, which means a lot of different colors of glass, and they imported it to make glass beads. Just these tiny pieces show the importance of the contact they had all the way from the Atlantic down to Arabic world with extremely long distance.
Yeah, their trading routes explain how they became so rich.
Yeah.
These Viking traders were the commodity brokers of their day. They amassed such huge wealth that they could afford to bury it in hoards to honour their pagan gods.
Here we have it. This is just a fraction of the hoard. A fraction of 70 kilograms of pure silver.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
You can hold it. Heavy?
It's heavy, yeah.
And we call them bracelets.
Bracelets.
It looks like it was more used like a kind of a coin, if I might call it that. You might call it ring money if you want to. There was also 14,000 coins. And this is actually English coins. And we have some German coins, and we have Danish coins. And these coins are only Arabic coins, all of them. So this was coming from the Arabic Empire.
How did they get so rich?
Gotland serves, as I see, some kind of a middleman in the Baltic Sea. So it was a natural stop for people coming from west, going east.
So they were like the middleman?
Yeah, the middleman in the Baltic Sea. And you know, they're always the middleman who makes the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And what did the Gotlanders have to offer the Arabs?
Iron. Selling products of iron, and most of all, swords.
So they were arms dealers?
Exchanged, yeah.
Arms dealing and slave trading were risky businesses, but they were clearly experts. And out of their success, and a pagan spirit of free enterprise, grew something else, perhaps their greatest legacy. The way they governed themselves. They didn't have kings. Instead, they developed a kind of democracy where everyone had a voice expressed at a yearly assembly called the Alting.
And how did this kind of sort of democratic way of living link in with their trading networks?
It seems that almost every farmer took part in that trade, even if they were living inland, not only on the coast. And we can clearly see it's a kind of an equal society. I think you also can see it in other islands, like in Iceland. You have this Alting in Iceland, Isle of Man, not to forget. It's almost the same kind of system. And to stay stable, I think also you have to make treaties with your surrounding neighbors. I was thinking they're sitting here and planning for the next voyage to the Arabic world. If you're on a river, you are very vulnerable to attacks. You have to make treaties. That's the way to survive, to go down to the Arabic world.
Mm. It's a lot of treaties between Gotland and the Black Sea.
It seems these Vikings were skilled politicians as well as unrivaled seamen. They were also intrepid explorers, democratic settlers, and astute traders. Yet the image of their barbarity still resonates.
Do you think Vikings have been misrepresented by English?
You have to think about who wrote all the stories about the Vikings and who wrote them, the monks. And of course they were not so keen to talk well of the Vikings.
The Vikings were pragmatists. They would merge into the societies they had colonized, and eventually they would adopt Christianity. Without doubt, they had done damage. Their raids on monasteries set back a body of science and knowledge by generations. But a new kind of society would emerge in Northern Europe. It would be flexible, adaptable and creative, able to exploit new ideas, and truly multicultural. But there was something crucial missing, something that earlier barbarians had destroyed when they overran the Roman Empire. The learning of the classical world and its tradition of the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake. But astonishingly, this had been preserved and in a most unexpected place. a place that remains the greatest secret of the Dark Ages. At the same time as the Lindisfarne Gospels were being written in Anglo-Saxon England, an Arab army crossed into Spain from North Africa. They were the Moors. The Christians of the time thought of them as Muslims and barbarians. But they would turn Spain, they called it Al-Andalus, into a land of culture, commerce and beauty. It is the greatest secret of the Dark Ages, Europe's Muslim state. So much of our knowledge can trace its roots back to southern Spain in the Dark Ages, because in this place at that time, art and science flourished. Literature, poetry and music abounded.
But most importantly of all, there was tolerance, and its capital city was Cordoba.
There were mosques and public baths throughout the city. There were orchards and gardens adorned with fountains. There were books and libraries. Paper, unknown in the Christian world, was readily available.
It was a very exciting moment. There was a rich intellectual life. There was a rich scientific life, which affected mathematics, astronomy, and medicine.
The Moors valued knowledge for its own sake. They prized the ancient texts of the classical world and translated them from Greek and Latin into Arabic.
There was an important library here, and representatives in the main cities of the Islamic East who were in charge of buying the first copy of any book that appeared and sent it to the library. It was the most important library in Europe at the time, without any doubt.
Today, the magnificence that was once Cordoba can still be glimpsed in what was the Great Mosque.
This was obviously the biggest mosque.
This was the biggest mosque, yes.
But were there many others?
There probably were 15 or 20 other mosques.
And how many worshippers do you think this could have held?
At the end of the 10th century, probably 4,000 or 5,000 people together at the same time.
It's a lot.
There was no altar here. The entire prayer hall with its 800 columns was a holy place. Many of these columns are still adorned with the signatures of the proud Muslim craftsmen who made them. But this was much more than just a place of devotion. It was a meeting space and place of learning. Students would attend classes, sitting beneath these columns. Just like in Christian Northumbria, religion would drive scientific inquiry. Muslims needed to establish the exact length of the lunar month and the direction of Mecca for prayers. This sophisticated sundial was made in Cordoba in the 10th century.
The instrument is signed, the work of Ahmed ibn Safar. These sundials, which have a Greek origin, have certain adaptations that correspond to religious needs, such as the appearance of this curve, which would not appear in a Greek sundial.
It is a development of a classical Greek design that has been adapted to mark the time for Muslim midday prayers.
The kind of sundials you see, for example, in Saxon churches in England, they are far more primitive.
So the Muslim science was more advanced than the Christian science?
Oh, definitely. At the second half of the 10th century, there is no doubt about it. I think scientists were interested in nature, and they had the opportunity to read everything the Greek had written and to develop it.
So you're saying that the Muslims changed it on the way they added to it?
Oh, they did change it all the time. And they were adding new developments to Greek science.
The Moors perfected many scientific instruments. One of the most remarkable was the portable astrolabe, a pocket calculator of the stars. It had many uses, from simply telling the time of day to predicting the future.
You must understand that astronomers had to live on something, and one of their ways of living was casting horoscopes.
But it's very portable, isn't it? I mean, these are as portable as CDs today, really.
It can be very small, or it can be enormous. I have seen astrolabes this size. Muslim Spain was a bridge through which all Arabic science reached Europe. For example, you have the introduction of the Hindu numerals, the numerals we are using nowadays. Muslim Spain allowed Europe to recover a scientific and philosophical heritage that had been entirely lost.
Here, science and knowledge had status. Muslim scholars translated Greek, Persian and Latin into Arabic, and then built on it further to create new bodies of knowledge. Students from all over Europe travelled here to meet Muslim, Christian and Jewish scholars, to learn philosophy, mathematics, science and medicine. Foreign visitors were also able to admire the Moors' practical skills. They were not only scholars and craftsmen, they were ambitious town planners too.
Now the whole city goes this way except this building, and this is orientated in a completely different direction. It's orientated towards Mecca because it is a mosque, although it is 4 degrees out, which for these times was very accurate.
Water was especially precious to the Moors, and they were highly skilled at irrigation. Water was elaborately channeled into their cities for fountains, bathhouses and flushing toilets.
Now the Moors were a very clean people, and even their toilets tell us this, because not only did they have a sink, but they also had a flushing system. And this type of toilet is still used today in certain rural areas. Over there, there's another one. Shouldn't be looking over there.
To me, the achievements of Al-Andalus are summed up in the life and work of one man. His name was Albucasis. He is known as the father of modern surgery. Albucasis wrote a medical encyclopedia in 30 volumes. His work on surgery was a breakthrough, portraying medical instruments complete with detailed explanations for their use. These are replicas of Albucasis' amazing Dark Age surgical instruments. They were used for everything from midwifery to the treatment of bones and joints. But how practical were they? I have come to a hospital in Cordoba to compare these ancient surgical instruments with their modern counterparts.
They are really amazing. Here there are instruments for operating on nasal bones, the ears, the eyes, dental surgery and skin surgery. Just like modern surgery has specialized instruments for each type of operation, these are just the same. This is a scalpel. The only difference lies in the disposable blade, which can be sterilized. The old instruments would be sterilized by cauterizing with fire. This instrument is for inserting in the veins to remove blood clots. It's a hook. Here we have a modern instrument, similar in shape. It also serves the same purpose, to grab the damaged surface of the varicose vein, making a kind of knot and then pulling.
Do you believe these instruments were actually used to perform surgical operations?
No doubt at all. They are truly amazing. In the 10th century, they were able to carry out surgery in order to relieve pain, which was formerly unthinkable. I do not think any member of the medical profession currently admits to what medicine today owes to Arab medicine. Medicine has always been founded on Greek and Roman knowledge, and Muslim medicine has been disregarded.
The glory that was Cordoba was short-lived, and Al-Andalus fell into civil war. The great libraries were destroyed. These are just a few parts of what's left of this 1,000-year-old Muslim health spa, really, but it wasn't really that healthy for everyone because in the next room, the last caliph was actually assassinated. The Christians eventually reconquered Cordoba, and in a final gesture, the great mosque was converted into a Catholic cathedral. Moorish culture was destroyed, but its books and legacy would survive. Whole libraries were seized by scholars of the Christian West and eagerly translated into Latin. Eventually, they would reinvigorate European intellectual life. In this way, algebra, mathematics and medicine reached Northern Europe. Without the Moors, the forgotten people of Dark Age Europe, a precious harvest of scientific knowledge from the ancient world would have been lost. I've never really believed the myth that in the Dark Ages culture simply ground to a halt, but what I've seen here in Cordoba has amazed me. The Muslim scholars of Moorish Spain developed scientific ideas which we take for granted today. But it was also a bridge over which the best of the classical world travelled and was later to re-emerge stronger and richer 500 years later in the Renaissance. In my journey through Dark Age Europe, I've learned things that have amazed me. I've found that in the world the barbarians built, there were examples of tolerance and experiments with democracy. They weren't barbaric, and it wasn't a time of darkness and chaos. The barbarians brought to European society something distinctive and different. They were adaptable and pragmatic, happy to take a good idea from anywhere and make it their own. They were economic migrants relentlessly on the move in search of opportunities. They were independent and individualistic, good businessmen and natural adventurers. Without the barbarians of the Dark Ages, our world would be a very different place.